Welcome to Leveraging Inspiration, the Inspired Patent Podcast, where we explore the world of innovation, creativity, and intellectual property. I'm your host, Wayne Carroll, and I'm joined with Mark Kirstein, an expert on AI compliance and privacy. We're excited to bring you stories and insights from inventors, entrepreneurs, and experts in the field. Now, before we get started, I want to make it clear that while I am an attorney, I'm not your attorney unless you've hired me. The information I provide on this podcast is for educational and informational purposes only. I'm not providing legal advice, and nothing in this podcast should be construed as creating an attorney-client relationship. So with that disclaimer out of the way, let's jump in and dive into the world of patents and specifically AI, privacy, and how it impacts intellectual property. So today, I'm talking with Mark Kirstein, and he is an expert who helps companies to get compliance and a strategy that works for them when setting up AI and privacy practices in their business. Welcome, Mark.
Thanks, Wayne. I appreciate the invite. Looking forward to our discussion.
When you work with a company, do you talk about their intellectual property? When you're talking about AI and how to set that up for their company?
Intellectual property issues hit AI from multiple different angles. They hit AI from the input or how you train the model to the security angle as to the potential of exposing protected or sensitive information, which might be intellectual property, might be privacy or other sensitive information like that. And then the intellectual property issues hit on the output as well, in the sense that there's a lot of ambiguity. This is your world more than mine, but there's a lot of legal ambiguity right now as to the ability to protect the work product when AI has been used to generate part of your work product or your output.
Okay. And how do you help companies navigate through that? What do you set up, and how do you know what they need?
I think the world that we live in right now, is particularly with artificial intelligence, is one of kind of the Wild West, where people are embracing a technology that is transformational, and they also see the larger companies having already embraced it, starting to move it and make it, kind of democratizing artificial intelligence to the broader business community and ultimately out to the end consumers. But from a business standpoint, many, if not most of the companies that I talk to, when they first think about AI, they don't think about the risk attached to it. And the risk being intellectual property issues, like we just discussed, privacy issues that we also brought in as to the potential of exposing privacy information, more foundational. And the first thing that I would say to all of the listeners is just look out at your organization and realize that whether you know it or not, your employees are already using artificial intelligence in some capacity to get their jobs done, because it's in the public domain, and they're going to use it to make their jobs more efficient. If you don't have a set of policies and procedures around that to set up what the rules are, as far as, hey, by the way, don't put sensitive information into a chatbot. Don't put code into a chatbot that is your proprietary information, because effectively you're putting it into the public domain at that point. So first, back to your question of how do you approach a company? Let's look at this from a holistic standpoint as to what the risks and guardrails are for how I deploy AI to achieve my goals of increased automation, increased functionality, increased capacity. It's got great benefits, but how do I do it in a safe, ethical, and responsible way, considering the implications that are potentially opened up? And the starting point for that is to start with an acceptable use policy for you and your employees, because that forces you to say, all right, well, what do I want to do? Is it okay for them to use the AI engine when I'm generating marketing copy, for example? And what are the expectations as far as reviewing that copy from a human perspective before you send it out to your clients, or potentially use it yourself, so that it doesn't make hallucinations or make mistakes that are going to damage your reputation? So again, those are part of another set of the risks, is hallucinations because you didn't monitor it with human insight, or damaging your reputation because it makes mistakes or it says things in ways that you didn't anticipate.
Yeah, there was a story I heard way before ChatGPT. I think it might have been 5 or 10 years before. A country over in Europe, they had a festival and they decided to use Google Translate to translate a flyer and announcement and put it on the web to English. And when it translated it, it changed the nature of the festival to some in terms of how it translated it into something completely different. So people were showing up expecting a completely different kind of festival.
Oh, interesting. And who knows what the ramifications of that are.
Yeah.
Similar issue earlier in my career, I was working on an interface, like a technical digital interface between computers called IEEE 1394. More broad consumer name was Firewire.
Okay.
And the problem with Firewire is when you translated the term into Japanese, it basically translated into your kitchen is on fire. So think about trying to market a potential use case to people in Japan where the name of the product is your kitchen is on fire. So bringing it back to the AI perspective is just being mindful about what you're doing and about realizing that the artificial intelligence is not foolproof by any stretch of the imagination, and that we ultimately have to take responsibility for how we use it and what the results are, because we're the ones that are deploying it either to our employees or to our customers.
Okay. Now, for those who are like startup with their first business, could you give a quick overview of what is sensitive information and does it affect every company or is it just some companies?
Ethically, it affects every company. Legally, it affects a subset of all companies. But back to the definition of sensitive information, there's a number of different categories, but basically, personally identifiable information is considered private information, that if you capture that information and process it in your tools and in your company, and you're processing data from your customers that include personally identifiable information, that's sensitive. Now, that's sensitive at the minimal level. The more highly sensitive information is when you get into personal health information, right? So that now you start to cross over into, depending on the nature of your business, potentially into HIPAA violations, but even beyond HIPAA violations, most privacy legislation, either globally or in the US among states, has some special categories like personal health information that is considered highly personal information, biometric information, facial scans, voice scans, things along those lines, things that AI is really good at. When you're storing and processing that information, that's considered sensitive information. Educational information, a different set of laws in that instance as far as how to protect educational information. But if you're in doing anything relative to the educational institutions of the United States, they're regulated by legislation called FERPA, which is to make sure that the student information is held properly and ethically and legally to protect it. So any of those classes of either personally identifiable at the top level or more sensitive information that gets into special classes is the sensitive information. And then the second part of your question was, is every company subject to this or just some subset of companies? And that depends on a number of different factors. At the highest level, Europe has very strict privacy regulations, a law called GDPR. And if you have or process information associated with European citizens, you start to become subject to the GDPR, even if you're operating primarily in the United States. We may, as consumers, have seen places where companies ask us or designate where we live as so that they can figure out how to treat our information based on the legislation that's attached to particular locations. In the United States, there's now 15 states that have privacy laws, and that has grown dramatically over the last 18 months. So about most of those 15 have passed their legislation in the last 15 months. Most of that legislation is now in place, meaning it's operational. But most of the legislation has size limits on the companies as far as how big the companies have to be before they become subject. And it's not so much, it may be, and again, this varies state by state. So part of it might be based on how much revenue you have. The other part is how many citizens' data do you have in your database? When you hit
Okay.
those certain thresholds to say, I suddenly now have more than 25,000 residents of a given state, then I become liable to that particular state for the privacy regulations, and I have to manage specific criteria, things that as consumers we've started to see, things like opt-in, opt-out, consent to cookies, the right or that a consumer has to demand access to their data, in some cases the right to be deleted or correct the data. Most of the legislation includes the right to access your data and correct your data. Some of it is more oriented around deleting the data.
Okay. Yeah. And data really does affect people. I actually have been fighting with an insurance company. 2 years ago, my son was in an accident and we consider it his car. It was titled under my name so we could all have the insurance together. But he wasn't driving. And it was on I-80 in Wyoming. If you've ever driven that the day before Thanksgiving, it could be treacherous, and it was. So, totaled the car, totaled the median, which was more expensive than the car. And the insurance company said my son was driving, so it was his fault, but he wasn't driving. So for the past 2 years, they've been affecting my insurance rate. They report it to a database, and that database says my son was at fault. So if I go to get insurance from anybody else, until that database is corrected, that affects me. So things you may not realize how much your data that other people are managing affects you. And certainly insurance is highly regulated and the data is regulated, but that doesn't mean they get it right all the time.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. And that's why some of this legislation gives the consumers the right to make corrections. And again, the company that's holding the data can contest those corrections and try to validate their belief that your son was driving, but you have the right to ask them to make those corrections, and they have to take certain steps to validate and respond to your request. Those are the things that if you're the company who's a data controller, that means that you're the ones that owns that data. You're responsible for complying with those laws if you're big enough or if you're in the states that have those type of laws in place.
Yeah.
Just to broaden this conversation a little bit, is data, because we started off talking about artificial intelligence, and artificial intelligence, the most direct way of thinking about it in this context is data is the oil that powers artificial intelligence. Nothing moves or nothing happens without the underlying data. So the cleanliness of your data, the rigorousness of your data, the representativeness of your data, the precision of the data, the more you have that's good and solid, the better as far as artificial intelligence, which, by the way, is a bit of a contrast with the principles around privacy, because privacy principles says data minimization is the way to go, meaning only collect and process the information that you need to achieve the task. And some of the legislation actually mandates that you behave that way, that you only collect and process the information you need. That means if you're a restaurant promoter, some marketing application focused on promoting restaurants or something to that effect, you may not have the right to ask them about even their birth date. Although in birth date, you might be able to make the case, hey, I want to send them promotions on their birthday to get some free coupons. Therefore, there was a purpose behind it. But if you didn't have the purpose attached to the reason you collected the birth date, then from a privacy standpoint, you don't want to collect anything other than what you need. Only the information you need. That's data minimization. From an artificial intelligence, it's a little bit of a contrast, because I really want to collect more data, because the richer the data set, the more valuable it is from helping the automation be effective. And then in some capacity, one way or another, whether you do it directly or whether you monetize it in some other ways, monetizing the data. But getting back to the big principle behind, data is the oil of artificial intelligence. Every company that is working aggressively, and the bigger the company, the more scale they have, the more capacity they have to work in this domain, has recognized how valuable the data is and how compelling it is, which means they just want to collect more of it. They would just
Right.
want to collect it, process it, use it for their purposes. So the things that you're talking about, your data has suddenly ended up in this database, and this database is now used by the insurance companies. Anybody who can access that data, and there's a bunch of rules as to the legal access to the data and whether you have rights and whether you've given consent around those rights to the data. But all those other companies want access to that data also so that they can create new artificial intelligent apps that do different things. And that's why artificial intelligence and privacy are so tightly coupled with each other, because all that data has personally identifiable information that you need to be considering. How am I going to manage this if I build an AI app around this?
Yeah. Yeah. That's all the time we have for today. Thanks for joining us. I hope to have you back soon. And it's been a pleasure. I know we barely scratched the surface here.
Yep. Yeah. There's a lot of different ways to go, and things are moving really fast.
Yeah. And that's why people need someone like you, because you may work with them this month, and next month there may be a new law, a new set of rules, or some huge PR thing that blew up in some company's face that you want to make sure doesn't happen to you. All
Right.
those things
Right.
can happen with data, that you want an expert available to actually help you and then be available when there's something that comes up.
Well, and I would add, I am also newly moving from the cybersecurity and privacy space towards artificial intelligence. This is a new field for basically everybody. So I welcome conversations and helping the community. The clock doesn't start running, or I should say the cash register doesn't start running to have a conversation, because for me, I learn more about the use cases. I develop more relationships. I start to build, a circle of trusted, people in the industry that will ultimately help in the long run. So if anybody wants to run some ideas or just chat about some of these issues, I'm more than happy to jump on the calls.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you. We'll put your contact information with the show notes.
Cool.
Thank you very much.